This video is about back-channel responses, or the little indicators and comments that your listener makes to you that help you to know what's going on in their mind, whether they understand or not. In one study, participants silently read little stories to themselves and then had to retell the same stories to a listener who was sitting in the room with them. For example, one story said, "The robber hid behind the door, and when the man entered the kitchen, he stabbed him in the back. He wiped the blood off the knife and rummaged through the drawers. Later, police investigators found his fingerprints all over the knife and had no trouble catching him." In this story, the knife is the typical instrument you'd expect to be used in a stabbing incident like this. In the experiment, half of the stories contained predictable instruments like this, while the other half involved unusual instruments, like an ice pick. When participants retold these stories with the unusual instrument, they were twice as likely to specifically mention the instrument that was used compared to when the object was a highly predictable one. Now, there are two possible explanations for this finding. First, it's possible that you, as the speaker, are trying to make it clear for your conversational partner that there was an unusual object used. However, it's also possible, as a second explanation, that the speaker is just describing the details that seem salient to them when they were reading it without trying to imagine what was important for the listener as they were hearing. Our textbook author mentions a specific story that illustrates this point well. She says, "I had an experience while traveling on a plane from my home in Calgary, Canada. I sat next to a man who was on his way home to Florida. He told me that he and his family were just coming back from a wonderful vacation in the Rocky Mountains. Evidently, they'd had a great time, quote, snow skiing. To my Canadian ears, it struck me as odd that one would bother to specify that skiing was done on snow. It seemed a bit like saying you'd eaten a bread sandwich or had bought a metal car. I asked my fellow traveler whether he would ever just say skiing instead of snow skiing. He patiently explained that yes, he would, but then that would take place on the water. In this case, my planemate revealed a lapse in audience design. His choices of skiing terminology seemed to have more to do with his own sense of what usually takes place when put on skis than of what I understood skiing to mean." Much of the time, it would be a good strategy to just say what stands out to you as important and guess that if you do that, then that will also satisfy the listener's needs. In that case, a conversation might seem fully cooperative, even though it's really just the speaker focusing on his or her own selfish needs for producing that language. For example, in the story about snow skiing, if the author of our textbook had also been from Florida, she wouldn't have batted an eye at the speaker's choice of words. Thus, in order to know whether the speaker is actually taking into account the hearer's perspective and needs, we have to set up a situation where the hearer's actual informational needs did not line up with the usual patterns of predictability. Just the same kind of thing that we just saw in that snow skiing story, where the needs of the listener and the needs of the speaker were not the same. So, recall back to that last study with the little vignettes. The researchers in that study created a new condition where it was easy for the hearer to infer even the unusual instruments like an ice pick because they were shown a picture of the event as the speaker told the story. So, like the listener might see this picture and the speaker was, had read this story about the knife, and they were then to describe this story to the other person. The person hadn't read these words, but they had seen this image here of somebody stabbing, and when they saw this image, of course, they could see that what was being used was a knife or an ice pick or whatever the vignette had employed as the object of interest. So obviously, the hearers who saw a picture of the weapon that was used should have no trouble figuring out the instrument, even if that instrument was never mentioned by the speaker when they were retelling that story. But speakers didn't seem to take that into account, like their partner's visual perspectives. They just ignored the fact that that was in the picture, and they still mentioned the atypical instrument, like the ice pick, twice as often as the more common one, like a knife. So this suggests that speakers were just mentioning the aspects of the story that were salient in their own minds, rather than using that additional detail of like the ice pick or whatever to disambiguate the potential confusion on the listener's behalf. But the story doesn't stop there. A later study used that same design we just talked about with the pictures and the stories and found the opposite, where instead of referring to the ice pick twice as often in those scenarios, they were equally likely to refer to the ice pick or the knife. So this time, the speakers did seem to recognize that the listener had access to certain information in the picture. So what gives? What was the difference? Well, in that study, the hearers weren't real participants. They were Confederates pretending to be participants. And these Confederates had to run through 40 conditions with different speakers, and they just sat there listening to those same stories over and over again. It's almost certain that in this study, the Confederates unintentionally failed to give what are called back-channel responses to their storytellers. In real life, hearers don't just passively listen and wait for the speakers to say what they have to say without showing any reaction. Even if you're not the one speaking, as a listener, you're often busy providing the speaker with a slew of cues about whether the speaker is being effective in his communication, like a furrowed brow, a quizzical look, a slight impatience to get on with the story and stop beating around the bush. And if the message is clear, then hearers might nod or make little approving sounds or say okay in a decisive way. But in this experiment, the Confederates who'd already heard that same story over and over probably weren't emitting the same kinds of cues and responses throughout the story that a naive hearer would, who only was hearing this story for the first time. So these back-channel responses are a huge predictor of our ability to disambiguate when speaking. If you fail to enunciate something clearly, your conversational partner might interject with a quick, huh? And then you know that you need to be sure and speak more clearly going forward in the conversation. So even though speakers are primarily focused on their own production needs when they're planning what they're going to say, back-channel responses from the listener can help the speaker to see things from the listener's perspective and try and adapt accordingly so that they get better at disambiguating potentially confusing things through the rest of the conversation.